Welcome to Anarchic Areopagita. My name is John Weeks. Today is Tuesday, October 21st, 2025. And my guest today is Keith Knight, managing editor at the Libertarian Institute, host of the Don't Tread on Anyone podcast, author of many great books and articles. Thank you so much for joining us, Keith.
Absolutely, brother John. Thank you for having me.
So, I've been excited to talk to you for a while now. Today I was looking to get your wisdom on social justice, the benefits of capitalism, and the long shadow of World War II. But just wanted to start by saying that your book, Domestic Imperialism, has had a great impact on me. And just the very concept of domestic imperialism is an amazing term, amazing idea. And for a long time, I've been familiar with the idea of libertarian realism, a term I believe um, coined by um, Justin Raimondo. But the idea is that when you're thinking about American foreign policy, and no doubt any nation state's foreign policy, but when you're thinking about American foreign policy, you need to realize that it's always intertwined, underpinned, driven by domestic political realities. And I feel like your idea of domestic imperialism is kind of the flip side of that. When you're thinking about the domestic political realities, you need to view the domestic population as a conquered people. And essentially, the state is waging this constant counterinsurgency against them. Um, so, loving those ideas, given all of that, why don't you lay out what's going on with this social justice in America?
What's going on with it is it seems to be waning more or less in recent years, certainly after Trump's second election. I think the progressive left is occupied with the movement for a free Palestine, which is a heck of a lot better than a fake social justice movement where they have to fabricate most of their stories. The atrocities in the case of Gaza are actually real. That's one of the things that differentiates them from the claims of racism, sexism, and homophobia that they constantly throw uniquely at the white countries. Of course, when it comes to claims of bigotry, they usually exclude Africa, they usually exclude the Middle East, they usually exclude Asian countries, they usually exclude Latin American countries. So that seems to be their primary focus. The problem is that they have more or less a lot of academics, a lot of politicians have found it to be so profitable to use the divide of race and the divide of gender and the divide of wealth inequality. They have done this so extensively for such a long period of time. It's the analogy that Thomas Sowell uses is it's as though they have poured pockets of gasoline all over the country, waiting for the right political arsonist to come around. So even though it's not something that's at the forefront all the time, it's on every news channel like it was in 2016 or in 2020. There's still a lot of fallacies that people believe in. The primary one that has really taken hold is the central concept that disparities between groups are proof of discrimination and disparities in income are proof of economic exploitation. I think both of those are false. Are there any in particulars that you wanted me to start with? The racism, sexism, the homophobia one? Where did you want me to?
We should definitely, I think we should start with race because it seems like that is just really kicking off in America. The racial tensions. Um, but just one point I wanted to make to your point about the Free Palestine movement. Um, it's it's a strange social psychology that we got going on, where I'll see people uh, advocating for Palestinian freedom against what Israel is doing, and I agree with them 100%. And then it's like that's the only thing I agree with them on. They're terrible on Ukraine. They're terrible on the social justice stuff. They're essentially communists or socialists. And I can kind of start to empathize with the American national security state in 1945 as they turn on the Soviet Union. You know, oh, so they were your ally and the Nazis were the enemy. And oh, now they're the enemy. And it's kind of like, yeah, well, at some level, people writing articles and sending out posts and protesting about what Israel is doing and not just, to the Palestinians or in the region, but what their influence is within our country. At some level, they're allies. As director of the Libertarian Institute, Scott Horton has said many times, Israel is the worst thing about the United States. And that's not just hyperbole. But then, if that issue were to be resolved, and hopefully it could be resolved peacefully, now you're dealing with people who are completely on board with this social justice narrative, completely on board with a government supremacist, anti-capitalist agenda. So let's start with race. What's going on with race? What is race? What is racism? Is America an irredeemably racist nation? Take it away.
Here is how I'd like to start the conversation when I'm speaking with leftists, or I've given this speech to leftist groups a number of times. You can actually find this full speech. I titled it Three Social Justice Lies: Racism, Sexism, and Homophobia. I presented it on Dave Smith's show, Part of the Problem. So I ask people in the audience, what do the following names have in common? Dylan Noble, Margarita Victoria Brooks, Robert Sly Cohn, Chad Michael Breinhold, Daniel Schaefer, Zachary Hammond, Tony Timpa, Kelly Thomas, Justine Damon, Ashley Babbitt, Duncan Lemp, and Jonathan Hurley. These, with the exception of Jonathan Hurley, who was technically armed, even though he had just stopped a shooting, what these names have in common is these are unarmed whites murdered by the police. Frequently, a lot of these have been caught on camera. The case of Kelly Thomas was caught on a security camera. The case of Tony Timpa, where an officer was putting his knee on Timpa's back while Timpa was screaming for help, saying that he couldn't breathe. I want to say it was 14 minutes that you could find this body cam footage of, almost identical to the George Floyd situation. On camera, cop has his knee on his back and begging for pain, and Tony Timpa ends up dying. So, what is it about the social justice movement that you could critique? Well, one of the things is they often use anecdotes instead of statistics. In a country of 330 million people, certainly, if it were white supremacist, we would only hear about the white names and we'd never know who George Floyd or Eric Garner were. So immediately, we don't have the wall to wall news coverage. Second, you wouldn't have to use individual examples. You could instead go to statistics. You have such a big country. Why are you focusing on individuals if you have such a bulletproof case? So, a gentleman by the name of Roland Fryer worked at Harvard University. He was in the economics department, and he wrote a paper with his research team titled An Empirical Analysis of Racial Differences in Police Use of Force. And this was published by Harvard in July of 2017. Here is the conclusion that he came to. On the most extreme use of force, officer involved shootings, we find no racial differences in either the raw data or when contextual factors are taken into account. That is me quoting directly from the paper. So immediately you can see that we should expect massive disparities in police shootings. This is why it's not exactly a mystery why 95% of people killed by the police are men. It's not exactly a mystery why, oh gosh, I gotta have these numbers somewhere. Why something like more than half the victims are between 20 and 40 years old. Not half the American population is between 20 and 40 years old, but men and men at that age with that level of testosterone tend to be much more aggressive. So we can see this massive disparity, yet it's not proof of discrimination. When it comes to the gender disparity of people in prison, men make up the vast majority of prisoners. When it comes to people who are executed on death row, you'll notice a gender disparity there. If you look at the history of lynchings in America, turns out there's a big gender disparity in which gender was lynched, even in terms of racial disparities. Yes, blacks were disproportionately lynched. However, I want to actually pull up those exact stats because that one is from an organization, the Tuskegee Institute. And you know what? Might not have those. Oh, here they are. Tuskegee Institute. Black victims of white lynch mobs between 1882 and 1930. This totaled 3,446. So, over the span of almost a century, we have 3,400 lynchings. With how much you hear about this, you would think that there were far more, considering, in Hiroshima alone, there were like 100,000 deaths. But this gets a disproportionate amount of attention. It's seen as the root of bigotry that was widely accepted by the population at large. However, what goes unmentioned frequently, the Tuskegee Institute actually says 1,297 whites were also lynched. In 23 states in America, there were more whites lynched than blacks lynched. So this completely changes the narrative from lynching was so bad it was a practice where whites would lynch blacks as a causal result of them hating them for their race. Actually, it was seen as mob justice, and a lot of whites were lynched as well.
Who lynched
According
the
to
whites?
according what?
Who lynched the white people?
It was generally other whites, especially in the case of those 23 states. Either way, these statistics are an empirical refutation of the concept that it was done on a massive scale, widely accepted, and whites were the perpetrators and blacks were the victims, and it was done because of their skin color. So that completely refutes the narrative. Now, when it comes to the concept of lynching, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, the term lynching came from a judge, Charles Lynch, who authorized the lynching of Tories during the American Revolution. There is dispute about that, but there are a number of sources that say it was mainly used by a judge to lynch other whites who were siding with the British at the time of the American Revolution. So the concept that lynching is a uniquely white thing that blacks suffer from is not the case at all. It is not a representation of how racist America was in its past. One of the indicators you can use to determine whether or not the amount of violence, how, let me actually rephrase that. One of the ways you can measure whether or not the society is racist and white supremacist is to look at the violence between groups. And according to the theory that we are a white supremacist nation, you would see a lot of white on black violence, and you would see very little black on white violence because blacks sort of are walking on eggshells, terrified of getting arrested, and they know the society they live in. There's a book titled Taboo 10 Facts You Can't Talk About by Dr. Wilfred Riley, a professor at Kentucky State University. And he says, rather than picking between two racialist sides and fighting for one or the other, American citizens can simply begin telling the truth about race relations. There is no race war going on in the USA, and there is certainly no epidemic of white on black crime. In fact, interracial crimes on an annual basis have been consistently 75 to 85% black on white for the last 30 years. Sorry, I lost my train there. 70 to 85% of the time, when there's an issue between blacks and whites, the black tends to be the aggressor against the whites. That is not me vilifying blacks at all. Men are more violent than women. As I've said, I don't want us going around negatively generalizing men. My demographic is especially violent. I'm 29 years old. Young men have a very bad reputation. Um, Riley goes on to say, more importantly, there is no horrifying epidemic of interracial crimes of any variety because 84% of white murder victims and 93% of black murder victims are killed by a mundane member of their own race. So, when it comes to these big stories, we see, first of all, they are anecdotes. Second, we see anecdotes on the other side. Third, when we look at these statistics, the concept of white on black violence is just not as big as these social justice warriors are making it out to be. We see disparities all around us in basically any realm of life. We also see disparities between groups in every country going back to ancient Egypt. So the fact that there are disparities in important aspects of life is not proof of discrimination, and it certainly does not justify growing the power of an already very big government to rectify these disparities.
Well said. Now it seems like, yeah, the narrative you get within the captive media is that there's an epidemic of white supremacy and white violence against black people, and that the entire system, in particular the justice system, but the entire social, economic order, political orders, cultural orders are structurally racist. So even if an employee of the police department is not racist, even if an employee of the police department is black, the police department is always racist. And what you're saying is that the empirical data does not support that view, but that view does support the agendas of state actors.
Well, certainly, and it's important to, say that the SJW left is correct when they are. So when you come across an example of someone like Mark Furman, a literal white supremacist police officer, if you remember him from the OJ case, he had these recordings which he thought would be confidential were actually released. That is an example of absolutely you have to give them their due. So every now and then you will find one example of something that they say is everywhere all the time that we, are still not free going back to 1619. Of course, that's fake. But when they have genuine examples like the Mark Furman example, absolutely.
That's a
That
good
is,
example.
it's important to give them their due
But
because
at the same
the
time,
the truth is more important.
I mean, the fact that that Mark the Fuhrerman was a notorious racist and white supremacist, that was not evidence of the innocence of OJ Simpson.
Of course not, and that was the fallacy, but it certainly poisoned the well for the
100%.
evidence that they found around it. So, absolutely, grant the left Mark Furman, and then say they are wrong about everything else when it comes to racial issues. There's a very important line in a book titled "Civil Rights: Rhetoric or Reality" by Thomas Sowell, because the assumption is, if you are an oppressed group, the way you get power, the way you increase your wealth, the way you improve family dynamics and societal well-being is you go to a lot of protests, go to rallies, engage in democratic deliberation, you vote, your votes result in politicians being elected, those politicians change laws on your behalf, and then society changes as a cause result of the laws. Realize this is an extraordinarily exhausting process that is unlikely to yield benefits. How many times have people tried to have a petition, get signed and then get passed? And then once it's passed, does it get enforced? Thomas Sowell makes the excellent case that, Jewish Americans have disproportionately high incomes compared to the Christian majority. I'm assuming we're Protestant Christian majority in America. He goes, how is this explained through the lens of SJW nonsense? He says Asians have lower violent crime rates than whites do, accounting not because they have a small uh, population in America. He's already accounted for that in per capita population numbers. So Thomas Sowell takes on the concept that if you want to be wealthy, you have to advocate for minimum wage laws and non discrimination legislation. He says in the book, Japanese immigrants to the United States also encountered persistent and escalating discrimination, culminating in their mass internment during World War II. But by 1959, they had equaled the income of whites. And by 1969, Japanese American families were earning nearly one third higher incomes than the average American family. If you look at I think he wrote this in the early 80s. So you can even check today on census.gov. According to the white supremacy theory, whites have the highest incomes. Everyone else works for barely minimum wage, and not even minimum wage because the white supremacists can just get away with breaking the law with their white privilege. You see, of course, Indian Americans, Vietnamese Americans, Hmong Americans, in many cases, Filipino Americans, these people from East Asian countries have much higher incomes than the average white income. Wilfred Riley makes the case that the poorest places in America on the East Coast, centered around West Virginia and Kentucky, those are almost 90% white areas. So, in other words, why don't we try looking for a different explanation as to, since there's so much variation in the data, let's look for a different explanation as to what causes disparities in incomes. You can see that there is a big disparity in income between the average 16-year-old and the average 46-year-old. You might look at this and say, we need an equal pay act for people at different ages because the 16-year-olds are being discriminated against. Well, if you know nothing about the world, you might think that that would help. The reality is 16-year-olds are less reliable. They have a high school to go to in many cases, so they work less hours, they have less on the job experience, they create less value, fewer employers want them. With those fewer options, they don't have as many choices and end up accepting an entry level job that pays very little until they start to get older, gain on the job experience, and can demand a higher wage from business owners who are competing for the best employees. So it's such an empowering message that Soul gives, because the SJW message is, John, there is nothing you can do in your current circumstance. You don't bother showing up to work on time. That's just feeding into the system. Don't ask for on the job training. Don't try to be a good employee. Don't try to meet consumer demand. Don't try to read books about the industry you're in and increase your knowledge. That's all just a complete waste of time. What you should spend your time doing is showing up at rallies, screaming very loudly, maybe invest in a megaphone, maybe go around, throw some, go around to established businesses, throw bricks into, the windows, and really get the attention of people and tell them male lives matter. We're done with being discriminated against when it comes to police killings. That men are just too disproportionately killed, and you're not earning a wage as high as someone who is averaged 56 years old. Uh, I forget how old you are, but I think 56 is the highest income bracket in America.
I just
So,
turned 46.
oh, okay. So,
That's a perfect
yeah,
example.
those people who just happen to be 10 years older than you, they are rapidly exploiting you, and
I'm
you must
feeling the
destroy things.
exploitation.
Yep.
I'm gonna rise up.
So, so they tell you to completely waste your time with politics, and of course, there's never any mention of the fact that the money supply happens to be legally monopolized by the Federal Reserve and the quantitative easing policies. Without even getting into that, Thomas Sowell is such an empowering message that is far more important. Also, it's true, so there's that benefit. But also, it's just so much more empowering to know that there are things within your capacity that you can do. We obviously, it's not just because people are white; they have higher incomes. Are you familiar with the disparities between white, straight, Christian men in America? You think they all have the same income? If race and gender and even age were something that explained the differences between the income of the races, you would think all straight white men had roughly more or less the same income, but we don't see that at all. We see massive disparities as we do everywhere else in society.
Well, we're going to get into the sexism piece and the homophobia piece. But just as we, transition to that, still thinking about these disparities, it seems to me that, like, if you do this thought experiment, a thought experiment that I got from the great thriller novelist Barry Eisler, who was actually the first guest on my show, and this is the second episode of my show, so I get great guests. But his thought experiment is, imagine that a Martian came to Earth and you have to explain stuff to them. So the Martian comes to Earth and I'm like, look, when it comes to sexual orientation, you have to understand that is 100% genetically determined. Don't you ever say that there might be a cultural influence, ever. When it comes to intelligence, that's 100% cultural. Don't you dare say there might be a genetic underpinning to intelligence. And that seems to be part of the social justice ideology. And it seems to be like kind of at the center of how touchy these issues can be. And there's a great talk that the Harvard professor, Steven Pinker, gave. He's talking about hanging out with Noam Chomsky. And Chomsky said to him something like, we have an obligation to seek the truth. And when we find it, to acknowledge it, or at least to say, based on the empirical data, this is what seems to be true. That being said, we don't have to ask every question right now. But I feel like we're kind of at a place where it's becoming more and more urgent to ask these questions. So when thinking about these racial disparities and then going into the sexism and the homophobia, could you talk about like what you believe is causing these disparities? What's behind these statistically significant differences?
So on that, I just don't have enough info to make anything conclusive. When I look at the genetic similarity between East and West Germans during the Cold War, I would see that the massive disparities are the result of their choosing to embrace the institutions of private property in the West and not doing so in the East. I'm assuming that the North and South Koreans are very genetically similar, but we see two very different cultures. When you look at Botswana and Zimbabwe, Zimbabwe, of course, was taken over by this Bolshevik Mugabe. I would assume people in that geographical area, racially, genetically similar. You have similar races in places like Bosnia, and over there they fight over, religious sectarianism in many cases. Um, I don't exactly know the cause, but I still don't see that. Let's say the first of all, the races have evolved in different climates, different environments for tens of thousands of years minimum. It would be shocking if there were no differences between the races. And even if there were biological differences, that does not automatically mean that you advocate, enslaving or oppressing this group. I believe men are more violent than women. It's cross-cultural. It's in many cultures. It's cross-time, going back since the beginning. It's cross-species. We see male animals more violent than females in general. So that is totally biological. Men have something like 17 times the amount of testosterone than women do. That's biological. That's a biological difference that I don't think justifies oppressing men as a cause of result. So even if
Wait,
the
so you don't think the
evidence
state should set up an agency to genetically engineer men to be less violent?
not yet, not yet. The state has a pretty bad reputation. Once they get the reputation back up, then of course I'll be advocating such a thing.
Very charitable of you.
Here is Dr. Brian Kaplan, the economist from George Mason University, and he says, here are 6 things that can be said briefly to a feminist to get them a little more insecure about this "the world hates women" idea. 1, men are overrepresented at the bottom levels of society. They do most of the nasty, dangerous work, are much more likely to be homeless or in prison, and much more likely to kill themselves. 2, men spend much more time on the job than women. 3, the law heavily favors women in child custody and child support disputes. 4, men are more likely to be victims of violent crime. 5, men are much more likely to die in combat. In fact, during serious military conflicts, they face military slavery, the draft. 6, women view men as success objects. So, of course, there was so much to each one of these. All this is to say that men being overrepresented at the bottom levels of society does not prove discrimination, even though I just was looking at the OSHA figures the other day. Something like 90% of workplace deaths are one gender. I won't tell you which gender it is. You might assume it's women because the world just hates women so much that we don't care if they die on the job. But check out the OSHA numbers, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, on which gender is 90% of the workplace deaths. Of course, just because you have this disparity does not mean they're being oppressed or discriminated against. Even if statistics showed that, well, the average person, man or woman, tends to value the presence of another man less than another woman who's more likely to be sat next to on an airplane. Even if that came out, it in no way means that, well, the state should change the way that the society is run by imposing anti-discrimination laws. We just had an excellent case of segregation and discrimination headed by the company Uber. So Uber is a great capitalist innovation that has increased access to the product and service of being transported to tens of millions of people, myself included. One of my favorite capitalist products to use. Uber wanted to appeal to women and men, I guess. You're improving, you know, how you treat your female customers. Men also like that. By having something called Women's Plus or Women's Preferences, this would allow women riders, not men, are not allowed to do this on the app. Women riders are able to select only women drivers. Now, one way to look at this is terrible. Apartheid. This is segregation. We need a Male Lives Matter movement. Uber needs to be put out of business. Let's, quit our jobs and spend our time protesting. Another way to look at it is, well, men are disproportionately violent. And if we really want to change things, men can stop being more violent against women. And the good men in society can disavow unequivocally the violence against women. That is probably a better approach. So immediately you see that they run into an issue. It's inherently discrimination and segregation by allowing women to make choices based on who they can, choose to temporarily employ for a ride. But there's nothing wrong with this, and thank God. I hope it's extended to uh, all genders, all races, all ethnicities, all ages can discriminate. The very fact that there's an age of consent law immediately implies that you can and should discriminate against people based on their age. I think this is a good thing. I support decriminalizing all voluntary segregation in society. Thank you so much to Uber for leading the way. Now, immediate issue with this when it comes to Uber. What is a woman? According to Uber, a woman is someone who identifies as a woman. So some of these riders, these female riders that say, yeah, I'm going to wait longer, I'm going to pay a little more because only 1/5 of Uber drivers are female, but I'm going to get a woman and I'm going to feel so much safer. Totally get that. A lot of them are surprised when a man shows up to, pick them up, but this is someone who identifies as a woman. So again, if you don't embrace the concept of voluntary contracts and the right to discriminate, uh, the social justice narrative has no justification for first this women's only app in general. It's a section of the Uber app, and two, if a person with what they refer to as penis owners, if a penis owner wants to identify as a woman, well, that's who a woman is. Get in the car. So immediately, you're not able to find any consistency in the very people who they think they're helping, they are actually hurting. You see cases like
Wait a
this
minute.
constantly. I'm sorry?
Can a penis owner who identifies as a woman use that feature of the app?
No, no. According to NBC News, I forget the woman's name, but Michael Strahan was on the panel. Penis owners cannot use the app. You know what?
But they can be drivers.
If they identify as a woman, yeah. That was my understanding. It was a quick clip on NBC. You know what? Maybe I have that. Maybe I'm mistaken on that. Maybe seems like there was less dispute. Either way, women are now allowed to discriminate. Praise God, I fully support it. And men who erroneously think they're women are taking advantage of this. And the SJWs are in a pickle they don't know how to get out of. So they're just going to say, oh, Uber just needs to be nationalized. It's not that impressive of a product, anyways. Yeah, something that provides a mass market to the average poor person. Yeah, I'm sure they're not impressed with it. But the disparities continue. You see things like men tend to pay more for life insurance and because they take more risk and have lower life expectancy. Men tend to pay more for car insurance. Well, men are very aggressive drivers, and while women are more likely to get into a fender bender, hit the pole at the Dutch Brothers, men are more likely to engage in violent road rage incidences. So, all this is totally legitimate. Um, that is my general theory as to and of course the gender wage gap completely fake. There was already a law that is referred to as the Equal Pay Act of 1963. So we already have gender equality when it comes to pay. I had a woman at Walmart who said to me, John, I'm going to test you. She said to me, you have to admit that Walmart is sexist. And I interrupted her and I said, I know they explicitly said they were only hiring women for the online grocery pickup position. She goes, that's not what I'm talking about. You and I work the same job and you get paid way more. First of all, I don't know how she knew that. I think someone in HR might have told her. But this woman comes up to me and says, Keith, you and I work the same job and you get paid way more than I do. Obviously, sexism. John, if you had to guess, can you think of one potential alternative explanation than sexism?
So you actually have the same position?
Same exact position. It's called online grocery pickup. You shop for customers, they call, you bring their groceries out to their car.
So I would immediately think you had either been working there longer
Correct.
or
That's one. Keep going.
and you worked more hours, or you were
Correct.
willing to work days where less employees are willing to work.
I would get
Holidays,
in at
Sundays.
4 a.m. Yeah.
4 a.m. That's pretty early. Yeah.
That's when we'd open, and our first customers weren't till 8. Yes,
She was
I
sleeping
worked
in.
at different times. I had worked more hours. She didn't account for the number of hours worked, and I had been working there for a longer period of time, and I asked for on-the-job training every single chance I could because I went to the manager and I said, "I'm currently earning X, which I really appreciate. I would like to earn Y within the next 6 months to a year. Can you tell me what I need to do to earn Y amount of dollars an hour?" And I clicked my pen and I sat there and I just stared at him and wrote down every single thing that he recommended. So yeah, we did different things. And
Okay,
also,
but Keith, I got to stop you right there because obviously the education system, the elementary school, right, the way that it assimilated you into the culture, shaped you into someone who would do that. It shaped her into someone who would not do that. So you see, we need
the
more funding for full day K.
The opposite is true. The culture that I grew up in said wages rise as a cause of result of people advocating for an increase in the minimum wage and things like the Civil Rights Act, making it so evil big business can't exploit the workers. I came across this knowledge in spite of that by coming across the work of Thomas Sowell. Yeah, right when I started at Walmart, I saw some people earned a small amount, some people earned a big amount. What are the big amount of people doing that the small amount are not? Showing up on time, asking for a raise, taking on the job training, showing up early, making sure they're never late, not calling out as much, asking how they can meet consumer demand. Um, and also, I would get tips from customers who were happy with my service. Now, imagine if her and I did the same exact thing. The example I use is imagine both Kristen Bell and I start an OnlyFans. We both publish 2 hours of content a day. We upload it at 1 p.m. Eastern every single day. We do the same amount of marketing. Everything is the same. Our genders are different, though. Is there any world where you would think Kristen Bell and I would have an equal income on OnlyFans? Because remember, this is not determined by the capitalist bourgeoisie. This is the members of the proletariat class determining whether or not they want to subscribe to one of us. Does anyone think that Kristen Bell and I would have the same number of subscribers and the same number of views if we had equal marketing and both put the same amount of effort into something? No, of course not, because people create different levels of value. If both LeBron James and I play basketball on camera for 2 hours, who do you think is gonna get more views? Who's gonna be able to sell more ads? Obviously, the black one is going to get a lot of money, and the white one won't get any money at all. There's nothing terrible about this. If both Chris Rock and I stand on a stage and tell jokes for 60 minutes, we do the same amount of work. Do you think Chris Rock and I are gonna get the same number of people showing up to the stadium? You think we're gonna be able to charge different prices for the people who do show up? We see disparities all around us all the time between all groups, between all ages, going back to the ancient pharaohs of Egypt, where I hear there was very little equality on in that Middle Eastern country at the time and to this day, because there is everywhere all the time. It's referred to as the iron law of oligarchy. We see a very small percentage of people having a very disproportionate amount of power and influence in all societies since the beginning of time. So please let's let this SJW racism sexism mythology die.
Well, let's shift into capitalism, but keeping in mind the SJW stuff because it is inherently anti-capitalist. And could we talk about a couple ideas revolving around that? One, the idea that capitalism itself is inherently racist, that slavery is inherently compatible with capitalism, that capitalism essentially is slavery, that what's valuable is the work you do, not the subjective value that people place on what's being produced. Um, and that the idea that, and I think this actually is really an unfortunate aspect of discourse in our society, but the fact that like showing up to work on time, asking for on the job training, saving money, investing, starting a business, being an entrepreneur, that gets uh, represented as white coded, which is really deeply racist. But this idea that that's like the white heterosexual heteronormative value system is capitalism, and that if you're not in any way, if you don't check every one of those boxes, that system is out to get you. Thoughts on that?
Well, when it comes to what the potential explanations are for why some people are wealthy and some are not, before looking at the individuals, you want to see that there are disparities between geographical areas. And what tends to happen, the explanation, is that there is more capital investment in certain areas than others. More capital investment only exists as a causal result of there being private property rights and the freedom to contract. With the right to own property, people are more likely to invest their scarce time and money in it, knowing they will reap the benefits from that property in the future and what that property yields, these capital machines. With those machines, you're able to produce products much more efficiently and for many more people. So that alone is the foundation. More private property, more freedom to contract, more freedom to trade, more options for consumers as to what they can purchase. You're more likely to do this because you know that the fruits of your labor are going to be yours, as opposed to given to someone else who might not appreciate them as much. So the biggest correlation when it comes to why some places are wealthy and others are impoverished is their general adherence to the private property ethic. Because things like slavery, things like the state, necessarily by definition violate the principle of self ownership and the concept of voluntary exchange. These things are incompatible with capitalism, with free market capitalism, and much more closely aligned to the concept of socialism, which is the institutionalized aggression against private property. So, when advocating for capitalism, the consistent position at the Libertarian Institute, which I know you know this, but for the viewers, is our attempt to advocate the policy of peace as opposed to war, not have double standards for the state, and decriminalize all economic activity between consenting adults. That is capitalism in one word. So that is how you can differentiate capitalism from non-capitalism. Ludwig von Mises, of course, said that what made a country capitalist was whether or not it had a stock market. Now, it's very difficult to use that as a metric, but I think it is a good rule of thumb because that necessarily means that companies are held privately and you're able to exchange money with other people in exchange for the titles to the stock in that company. So, private property, stock markets, these are the best indicators as to whether or not a country is capitalist. You're much more likely to make money as a member of the proletariat class if you have thousands of capitalists constantly competing for your labor. We would expect, according to socialists' nonsense, that basically 100% of workers get paid the minimum wage. Since, there's no market forces that determine prices or wages, it's just the state keeping the evil bourgeoisie in check. Of course, when it comes to the federal minimum wage, the research that I found, only 1.4% of workers get paid the federal minimum wage. It's extremely difficult to account for state minimum wages, so I decided not to put that in there because I found so much information, but I couldn't find anything bulletproof. But the question is, all you have to do is see if anyone you know does not earn minimum wage and in fact earn something higher. How is that explained by the socialist approach to economics? Because of course Milton Friedman answered this in his book Free to Choose, decades ago. He said, "Who protects the worker? Other capitalists who are competing for their labor. They want to offer them a better workplace. They want to offer them higher wages. So even if they want to pay them 1 cent an hour, they just couldn't get away with it because they couldn't find someone to associate that with them on a voluntary basis for such a low amount." So competition protects the worker and competition protects the consumer and gives people more options to buy more products and services than our ancestors ever could have dreamed of as a causal result of self-ownership, private property, and the freedom to trade. That's what people need to know about capitalism.
Tom Woods, who is on the board of directors of the Libertarian Institute, had a really great thought experiment that he did a few years back, where he said, imagine that you travel back in time to medieval France and you discover that many, many children are forced to work long, long hours so that the family can provide for itself. And you think that's terrible. Little kids having to work, they should be playing, should be free. So you have two options. Option number one, you can help the adults to learn to be more productive with their labor so they can create more wealth in less time and remove the need, or at least remove the perceived need, to press the children into working. Or option two, you could pass a law that bans child labor. And I thought, wow, that's a really great example because you see immediately that's not going to help anything. If people follow that law, they're going to starve to death. And then so they're not going to follow that law. So now you're going to need what? A secret police to go enforce the law. It's going to be a complete disaster.
I'm not even familiar with any leftist who opposes child labor. What they usually will say is, I'm against private companies having the right to compensate children in exchange for labor. That's what they oppose. But child labor is what takes place at every government school from ages like 3 to 18, and it's unpaid child labor. And then they go on to college to work for $0 an hour, which violates the minimum wage law. So I don't know a single progressive that I've ever spoken to opposes child labor. Tell them, oh, I was going to do my homework, but I'd be violating the child labor law, mom. Sorry, can't do my homework. This is probably the least well thought out thing that I have come into contact with when it comes to progressives. The other analogy that Woods uses is Ted Kaczynski has grown so powerful that he has destroyed all the machinery within society. Tomorrow, we all wake up and realize there are no machines. So we're now liberated from this tyranny of technology, and everything has to be made with our hands. What, if anything, would be the downside of all these machines? Realize the workers are still there. No worker has been killed. We still have the working class, which, according to Richard Wolff, is the engine of innovation. We still have the working class, the thing you say creates the wealth. What is the problem going to be? What, if anything, will the problem be? Well, those people would be less productive because they don't have access to that machinery that only exists as a causal result of the capital investment by the entrepreneurs and the business owners in the first place. It's such a good deal that these people don't realize. The way I sell it to them is, what we should do, we should have a society where the capitalists just they can't get a penny out of our pocket unless they get it from us voluntarily. They get none of our time. This means that if they want to invest in a big company, everyone just has the right to quit at any time. All the consumers, anytime they want for whatever reason, can just say, I think I'll shop somewhere else. Oh, the capitalists would hate that system. Let's make them work under that system. which of course is the ideal arrangement that any sane society would have. So if you just frame these things differently, you could see that any sane socialist would actually support these things. This is not just a theory. The cases where capitalists have gotten rich not because they're so kind and generous, but because they are self interested. First of all, what a ridiculous criticism. They're greedy, they're self interested. Yeah. Everyone who watches YouTube knowing they could be serving food to a starving person is self interested. Every parent who has bought a luxury item for their own child, knowing there are starving children in Malawi, is a selfish person. If you care more about your mother dying than you do all the people who were killed in the Crimean War, it's because you're self interested. Even though both your mom and those people were mostly innocent, imagine not being self interested and caring for everyone in an equal amount and allocating your time and resources to everyone equally. Because to do anything else would be self interested, selfish, and discriminatory. It's completely ridiculous. So, yes, Cornelius Vanderbilt was self interested because he was a member of the human race, as is every customer when they go into the store. They are acting in a self interested manner. The way that he was able to acquire so much wealth was by lowering the cost of steamship travel from $7 to 6 cents and started selling things on board and started transporting mail. That's how you're able to acquire large amounts of money, not because he made yachts only the one percenters of only JP Morgan could afford to ride on Vanderbilt's steamship. Of course, he engaged in mass production. Andrew Carnegie did this with steel, drastically lowering the cost of steel. John D. Rockefeller, very greedy man, drastically lowered the cost of kerosene so more people had the option to buy it. Henry Ford did not invent the automobile, but he improved the production process so he could have access to a bigger market so he could make more money. Steve Jobs did this with Apple. Why didn't they just make it? When did the iPhone come out? I remember it being like 2008 or something, and the Dance Dance Revolution video
I believe it
was
was
like the
exactly
only thing.
2008.
It was like the only thing on YouTube. And I can't imagine at the time there was a no price gouging the brand new smartphone. I mean, why didn't he just say it's $5 million each? This way, the 1% could just rule over us, have access to internet in their pocket. I think he literally could have done that, and there was no law stopping him because there was a built in incentive for people to meet the mass demand of consumers. So that's why someone like Steve Jobs, who, from what I hear, was quite a jerk to work with, that's why he was so nice because he didn't face the incentives of a politician who can get money without creating anything of value in exchange. He couldn't get money or the time of employees unless he was valuable enough to get their money in exchange. And that's why there's so many repeat customers. Amazon is not wealthy because, well, only Wall Street bankers can afford to shop at Amazon. Amazon's like the biggest, second, third biggest company in America because it precisely does the opposite. It offers us lower products and lower cost products and services to more people than ever before. Walmart, you ever walk into a Walmart and think this bourgeoisie place must have been built so Warren Buffett could have somewhere to shop? No, it's about mass production for the average person. And this is what we even see in healthcare. If you look at the cost of cosmetic surgery, much less regulated by the state and much less interfered with by insurance, by health insurance, then you see a drastic decrease in the cost of this aspect of the healthcare industry. The very explanation that leftists have for why is healthcare expensive? It's private. Well, you have to then account for all the microphones and all the computers and all the books and all the DVDs and all the free pornography and all the free YouTube videos, that all those things are privatized. Like, why are they so afraid of there being guns that are legal? If the gun industry is privatized, then only the top 1% are going to be able to afford guns. because they know the reality is if they are legalized in most places around the world, there is a built-in incentive to produce products for mass consumption. Um, so yeah, this is both the principled and empirical case for capitalism and free markets. And unfortunately, I only scheduled us for 1 hour. So can we talk about the Second World War at a different date?
Of course we can.
I appreciate it very much, brother. I'm very sorry if I went on too long on either of those other
No,
ones,
man,
but
you crushed it. It's beautiful. Do you have anything you want to plug before we go?
yes. So I put together a textbook called the Voluntarist Handbook. You can purchase it at Barnes& and Noble or Amazon, Barnes& and Noble website, not the store. If you want a free PDF of that book, this is the most valuable text I've ever come across. I probably spent 12, maybe 15 years indirectly researching for this book. There's a free PDF on libertarianinstitute.org. I summarize my findings and my reasons for leaving progressivism in the book John mentioned earlier, Domestic Imperialism 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism. That you can also get as a free PDF at libertarianinstitute.org. Only able to do this and provide these free materials and all the videos on my podcast free of charge without ads because we have such generous donors. So if you'd like to support my work by buying the book or just watching and sharing the videos, I would greatly appreciate it. We are trying to provide the free, low cost education that progressives pretend to offer you.
Well said. Thank you so much for coming on the show today, Keith.
Anytime, brother.